How do I know that the original version of Jesus is the version I have on the most ancient papyrus? How do I know the story didn't change? Well, it turns out you could actually test that. Let's take out every other verse. You can take out the odds or the evens and toss them out. They're unreliable. What do you have left? Enough information to know everything we know today about Jesus. The argument is not that we don't have enough reliable manuscript evidence.
Hmm.
It's that we don't like what it says. If the Gospels simply contain the story of a simple preaching rabbi in the first century who never worked a miracle, never walked on water, was not born of a virgin, didn't rise from the grave, didn't ascend into heaven, just a dude, a smart dude, and he said a lot of things we should live by because they're good advice. But he never did anything to claim, never claimed he was God, never, no, it's just a guy in the first century who
Hmm.
preached a bunch of stuff. There's not a single person who would look at the story of Jesus then and say, wow, that would be considered the best attested ancient sage in manuscript history.
Some of my audience is potentially familiar with your book and your work, and that another percentage is probably not. So what I would like to do is to basically just start broad and just give you a chance to essentially tell a bit about the work that you did as a cold case detective, and then to talk about how that work became relevant in your quest for God and in your curiosity surrounding the person of Jesus. How do these two pieces connect? Because I don't think necessarily intuitively connect. So what's that all about?
Well, in some ways, they're very, very similar when you work at cold cases are just homicides because every other crime has a statute of limitations. So eventually it'll close and you cannot work it anymore. It's past the statute of limitations, but murders don't ever close. They stay open. So if it's 40 years later, you could reopen a case if you had information. So my cases are in the range of 1972 to about 1998. So that's the range that I was working, and those are cases that are just unsolved murders in which you have reports in a big notebook, and then those reports are written by detectives, 30 years ago, and they are interviewing some witness who was 60 back then. So now this witness is dead, and often the detective is dead, or maybe, to be honest, is so old now that is having memory issues or whatever it may be. So now what do you do with these reports? You got these reports, supplemental reports of eyewitness accounts in which you have no access to the eyewitness or to the detective. How am I going to piece that together? How am I going to know if that's even trustworthy, even reliable, if any of it's even true? I can't go back and re-interview the witness, and I can't go back and re-interview the detective who wrote the report. Well, that really is the Gospels if you think about it. Now, I was working as a senior investigator at my agency, and as like most agencies around the world, most of them in America anyway, don't have full-time cold case teams. What you have are detectives who have an interest in one particular case from 25 years ago, and they may have been tinkering with it collaterally. It's a collateral duty. And all
Hmm.
of my first cases were just collateral duties. As a matter of fact, when I first looked at this case from 1972, I wasn't assigned to homicide at all. I was working in a surveillance team. But we had some liberty to look at things, and so but that process of learning how to verify if an eyewitness is telling you the truth is something that I think every detective has to master, regardless if you're working robbery or domestic violence or murder. You're going to have to figure out, can I trust what this guy's saying? And it turns out, in California at least, we have a jury instruction for this. 13 questions that we allow jurors to think about as they're listening to eyewitnesses. Now, I wasn't a believer when I first employed this process to my cases. My wife and I were together for 18 years before we became believers. I was 35 when I first walked into that evangelical church and listened to a pastor talk about Jesus. And I was not really interested at all. And interested, and I didn't even talk about it with my wife, other than to say I didn't want to go. I mean, I delayed the invitations to church. I ignored them, or the requests that should we go to church? Well, if you want, like my dad's not a believer, he's happy to go to church as a non-believer because he thinks it's a useful delusion. It can help you raise some moral kids. That's what his view is.
Hmm.
Although he is not interested in God at all, I was the same way. But when I walked in and the pastor said something provocative about Jesus, he just said that he was the most interesting, smartest man who had the most impact of anybody in the history of men. He's the smartest man who ever lived. That provoked me to buy a Bible and see if that was true. And then I only had one skill set in place. I mean, I suppose if I didn't know how to corroborate eyewitness accounts or to test an eyewitness, I might have taken some other approach. But for me, as I read through the Gospels, they
Mm-hmm.
had the texture of the very kinds of eye. So, for example, when we get a call out for a murder in the middle of the night, we're not going to be there right away. We're going to be one of the last people who show up. So I tell the dispatcher, hey, just make sure that the officers who are on the scene separate the eyewitnesses, because if you don't separate those eyewitnesses, you get the same account over and over and over because they've been talking to each other for the last hour. I don't want them to talk to each other. I want to get that messy, apparently contradictory
Mm-hmm.
collection of accounts, because then I will puzzle them back together. And just because there might appear to be a discrepancy between the accounts does not actually mean there is. And as a matter of fact, my job is to show how that is all puzzled together just fine. And there's no one actually, is mistaken. It's just that they are seeing it from different angles with different personal histories, different sets of desires, different things they focus on, some things they ignore. We all have a different way of seeing the world. And as I was reading through the Gospels, I said, wow, interesting that nobody took the time to get rid of all these apparent contradictions. And instead
Mm-hmm.
they left them as raw as they were. And that to me was something that provoked me to take the additional step. And that's why I started taking a detective's perspective as I was investigating the reliability of the gospel accounts. Because remember, people will say, well, they're not written by eyewitnesses. Okay, look, Matthew, the attributions we have on the Gospels are the most ancient attributions we have. Luke's telling you he's not an eyewitness of Jesus. He's telling you he's interviewing the eyewitnesses and servants of the word. He was with Paul, so
Mm-hmm.
he missed Jesus, but he knew the people who didn't. So he's interviewing them. So it's kind of like a supplemental report writer who's writing a report of an eyewitness account. It's like he's the detective. Here are the claims. So that's one kind of report. You have John and Matthew who claim to actually have been there to see this. And John even talks about it that way in the end of his gospel. And then you have Mark, who the most ancient sources we have tell us is writing at the feet of Peter, the account of Peter as Peter's protege or as his assistant or as his devoted helper. So in any case, those are the kinds of reports that I was comfortable approaching this particular way, where I'm testing them. I don't trust eyewitnesses. Eyewitnesses lie all the time. You test eyewitnesses. If they pass the test, then you can trust them. So the first thing I did was put the test to those four gospels.
So you're saying of the four gospels that we have either an actual eyewitness of the events or a person who is playing the role of investigator, if you will, and intentionally going about the business of talking to eyewitnesses for the purpose of piecing together a historical record of what happened. Am I okay? So where does this other idea come from that I sometimes hear online that that's not the case and that we and I'll give you I think you kind of know where I'm going with that one and I want which is basically like they all came hundreds and hundreds of years later. So let's tackle that one. And then the other one that I want to tackle is the idea that because we don't have original manuscripts that somehow we don't have any way of really knowing what happened in history. Can you kind of tackle those two? Because those are probably they're at least up there in terms of what I see coming up. I watch a lot of other videos like this and I see, yeah, but, and what about this? And so let's just go ahead and tackle those two face on.
Okay, so first of all, this is the first question you ask of an eyewitness. Was he really there to see what he said he saw? The second question is, can he be corroborated in some way? The third question is, has he changed his story over time? And the fourth question is, does he possess a reason to lie to us, a bias, something that could drive him to say something that's not true? So the first question is, were they really there to see what they said they saw? That's about whether or not those authors of the Gospels really wrote them in the lifetime of the eyewitnesses. Because let's face it, if you want to lie about Jesus, simply wait until everyone who knows the truth is dead, and you can say anything you want about Jesus. So if they're written in the second century, they could be something. They might even contain some elements or some bits and pieces of truth, but they cannot be considered eyewitness accounts because they're written well after the life of eyewitnesses. I needed to know, is there any good reason to believe these are early? Well, first of all, is there any reason to doubt them? But often I hear the doubts that people have. Well, that kind of language, it couldn't have been written by like First Peter. Oh, it couldn't have been written by Peter because the Greek is too sophisticated, as if a middle-class fisherman who spoke Greek his entire life growing up does not know how to speak Greek. I think we have a view of who Peter was. If you own boats the way that Peter and John and James' father did, These are people who were immersed in a place in the world in which people spoke Greek. Also, he can tell from his letters that he's actually using a scribe at some point, and we don't know what level of communication the scribe had. So, I mean, I think that this is, if that's what we're going to base it. How about this? Is there any ancient manuscript evidence in which that testimony is attributed to somebody else? No. So you don't have any evidence to this. Why is it you can't just accept the most unanimous claims of everyone who was there at the time who attributed this letter called First Peter to Peter? So I just don't know what is the evidence that would contradict our claims. Look, here's what I think it is. It's that you have the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. That's recorded in the book of Acts. And this is actually recorded by Luke, who wrote the Gospel of Luke also. And in the Gospel of Luke, Jesus actually predicts the destruction of the temple. So rather than admit that Jesus might predict something accurately, people are inclined to say, well, it must have been written after it happened because there's no way he could have accurately predicted this. This is inserted after he knew it had been destroyed.
Which is a sort of a circular argument, right?
It's a precept. Yeah. So the presupposition is that nothing miraculous could happen. So if I see something that's even like the miracles, those had to be written after people who knew better could have called them out as lies, because miracles don't happen. That couldn't have been written at early enough. But here's the problem with the book of Acts. It's not just that it's missing 70 AD, which is the destruction of Jerusalem. It's missing any reference to the siege of Jerusalem, which was horrific. If you're writing any kind of history around New York City, and it includes the early 2000s, and you fail to mention the Twin Tower attack, I'm going to want to know why. That in fact, any part of your story around New York City, if it's in the year of the Twin Tower attack, is probably going to include some reference to the Twin Tower attack. But this doesn't happen in the book of Acts. Not only that, Paul's still alive at the end of the book of Acts. We know when and where he dies. Peter's still alive at the end of the book of Acts. James is still alive, the brother of Jesus. Now, Luke reports deaths. He reports the death of Stephen. He reports the death of James, the brother of John. Why would you not mention the three most important figures in your book? James, the brother of Jesus, Peter, and Paul. Well, the most reasonable inference is that that stuff just hasn't happened yet. Unless, of course, you hold a bias against the supernatural and that Jesus could ever predict it. And I talked to Dan Wallace about this, who's another scholar in the New Testament documents. And I asked him, do we have any ancient texts? In other words, is it a battle of ancient pieces of evidence, the Christian pieces of evidence versus the non-Christian? And we have a tendency to, and we're inclined for whatever reason to trust the non-Christian ancient documents. He says it's not a document issue at all. There are no other documents that make any other contrary claim to the dating of this. It's just that people cannot believe that they could accurately record miracles or prophecy. So every time you see this in Old Testament criticism too, if some prophet predicts something accurately, then now there's a claim, well, it wasn't written until after that event occurred. It couldn't have been written before. It couldn't have been an accurate prophetic utterance, because we don't believe in prophetic utterances. So now you have a bias which is driving your dating. I can tell you this: it's not based on manuscript evidence. And when people say that it is, what they usually mean is, well, I couldn't believe that he could say it that way. That's much more similar to, okay, or for example, where is he doesn't ever mention his name in the book. Well, then you're going to toss out a lot of ancient attributed history, because this is common in attributed histories, that they are not, that the name of the author is not included in the text. So I think that for me is just not persuasive enough. What is persuasive enough is that they seem to know details about the first century, which are unique to people who would have had to live there. For example, a study has been done of all of the names, proper names for men and women that are used in the area around Jerusalem for Jewish men and women. Interestingly, of all the literature that's out there, the biblical authors seem to know what the proper nouns are, what the proper names are for men and women in the area of Jerusalem. For example, those proper names are very different in Egypt. If you're writing it from Egypt, like some of the late heretical gospels that come, centuries later, those folks don't know what people were called in the area of Jerusalem. Those folks who wrote those gospels didn't know the names of the cities. But every minor itty-bitty city and every familiar name for people who actually possessed those names in the first century around Jerusalem happens to be recorded in the Gospels. There are good reasons to believe those Gospels are as early as the church has always known them to be. But let me just say one more thing about it. You're right. We don't have an original manuscript, because this stuff was not written in the kind of format or written on the kind of material that would survive. and it often hasn't survived. The one thing for sure is that when ancient papyruses do survive, it's usually generations later when there's now a monastery or a structural system in place that could preserve the documents.
Mm-hmm.
When people are possessing these documents house to house, they just simply don't survive any more than the houses survive. But when you finally, for example, some of the most ancient manuscripts are preserved in monasteries or in buildings that by the time those buildings are erected, you now have a place to safely store the documents. So we don't have, we don't have the autographs, the originals.
Mm-hmm.
And then the question becomes, by the time you have an autograph, or not an autograph, or a copy that's available to us, it's often 300 years later. So how do I know that the original version of Jesus is the version I have on the most ancient papyrus, which only dates to say the 4th century or early 4th century? How do I know the story didn't change? Well, it turns out you could actually test that. Here's how we do it in criminal trials, because all the time this happens in cases where the defense team will say, well, that piece of property you're showing the jury, that was collected 30 years ago. How do we know it wasn't tampered with or changed 20 years ago? Somebody pulled it. This is like The Making of a Murderer,
Mm-hmm.
the Netflix series, right? The idea is that somebody pulls that piece of evidence out of property and tampers with it, and now it's part of the evidence set. Well, how you can test that is you have to ask the question, well, who first collected that piece of evidence? Did they take a picture of it? Did they write a report that was comprehensive? Did they describe it in some way? Some way we could be certain. And then when they gave it to the next person, did they ever take a report, write a report? How did they see it?
Mm-hmm.
And then they gave it to the crime lab and they took pictures and wrote reports. And then they gave it to somebody like me, who's a cold case detective, and I take pictures and write reports. And now I've got picture after picture after picture and report after report after report connecting the past to the future, the past to the present. And these are like links in a chain. And we call this the chain of custody. And so you have to present a chain of custody for every significant piece of evidence in a criminal trial. Well, there's a chain of custody for the New Testament. Now, when we can follow it, we can say, well, who did John give that information to? How do I know that what we have in the Gospel of John, we don't have the original Gospel of John. For all we know, that was inserted 200 years later. Well, okay, did he immediately tell somebody his claims? Yeah, he had personal students. Ignatius and Polycarp and Papias are all people who claim to have sat at the feet of John and other disciples, other observers, apostles. And so we could look at those. What do they claim about Jesus? Is he less supernatural? So for me, here's what the deal. I didn't have any church background. I didn't come out of the church. I came out of skepticism through these questions. I became a Christian. So I didn't have like doctrines of inerrancy that I was wrestling with.
Mm-hmm.
I simply needed to know, did the Gospels describe something that actually happened? I needed to know that. And the salient arguments, the salient claims of the Gospels that Jesus was born of a virgin, worked miracles, died on a cross, was buried in a tomb, rose from the dead, ascended into heaven. These are the major claims of the ministry of Jesus. I needed to know, are those early
Mm-hmm.
and often repeated? And they are early because you can trace them through the chain of custody from John to his disciples, Ignatius, Papias, and Polycarp, to theirs, Irenaeus, to his, Hippolytus. You can keep on doing this through history.
Mm-hmm.
And you can trace and see, is the story changing? Is he less supernatural in the beginning and more supernatural by the end? It's not true. The salient claims related to Jesus, his divinity, his miracle working, his birth from a virgin, his ascending into heaven after resurrecting from the grave, that stuff is early and repeated often. This is why
Mm-hmm.
Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, which is an early document, can say with confidence that he was told by those who were the eyewitnesses. Remember, Paul only met the risen Christ after the resurrection. So he didn't know the Jesus before his crucifixion. And he learned the entire story of Jesus's ministry and his details from the eyewitnesses. And he tells us this in a document that even skeptics will place in the mid to early 50s. Well, okay, so if that story is already out there in the mid to early 50s, and even skeptics will take 1 Corinthians and place it there, well, then what's the point of all this? I mean, it's clear that the story of the resurrection is early.
I
That's
think
the
there,
salient story. That's the story that
yeah.
changes everything. I'll tell you right now, if Jesus rose from the grave, he's different than Buddha and Muhammad and anybody who's
Mm-hmm.
Allah, anybody who's ever claimed wisdom from God. This is the one being who allegedly, and if it's true, has been on both sides of the grave. That gives him a different position of authority.
It's interesting because for someone like yourself who knows the historical context and who knows what these dates 20 years after the event versus 100 years after the event versus 400 years after the event, you have a context for the meaning of those different lengths of time following a historic event. But what's interesting, one thing I've noticed is that a lot of people don't. And so they view it like, heck, if something was even a year after and so said this and they tweet that, it could easily be a lie or it could easily be hearsay. And it's interesting to me because I think one thing that I'm seeing, just in the digital space at least, is that people, I think, are disillusioned. We're in like a post-truth culture is what, people kind of talk about. And people, I think, are very disillusioned with where does information come from? How do you know what's authoritative? How do you really know what's true? I think that even everything that happened in 2020 just put people through this whirlwind of trying to decipher narratives in order to understand what's true. And I think that in a post 2020 context, then people look back at these things that happened in the first century. And they're like, first of all, we're talking about 2,000 years ago. Second of all, you're saying something was 20 years after the fact. Goodness gracious, it could be anything, And I just want to highlight that for a second. And that's just my speculation. But I know that the skepticism has gone, well before 2020 as well. But I want to highlight this point, and I want you to, if you will, to give some context surrounding if you're going to apply that level of skepticism, what else are you throwing out in history, and how early is 20 years in antiquity, and how many sources does the New Testament give me the breakdown, because I've heard you talk about this before, and I think it's so huge where once you see the context of the amount of evidence that there is from within and from without, and the earliness of it and the multiplicity of it, then you realize in context that this is how I would phrase it, you're either going to be a skeptic to the point of essentially denying all history, or you're going to have to face the reality of what is recorded within these texts. But I know that you know more of the details than I do, so I want to tee you up for that and at least give some context for people to think about when it comes to this.
Man, you've just opened the door to so many different questions. It's hard to know where to on that. Okay, but let me just say a couple of things about when you work cold cases. Yeah, it's true that you have to be careful when you get somebody who comes into your trial, comes into your case. You find somebody who said, yeah, I was there 30 years ago, and I was afraid to say anything. So I didn't come to the police, and so I didn't file a report. And so now, but here's what happened. And you think, well, okay, well, why would I trust this 30 years later? There's any sense that you even have the opportunity to remember it correctly. 30 years have gone by. Well, a couple of things I look at. Number one, you might not have told the police 30 years ago, but you probably shared it with somebody, your spouse, your sister, your mom, somebody, and they just stayed quiet with you. And so I want to talk to that person. I want to see who you've told this to over the last 30 years to see if that story has changed. So the idea that you might hold on to a truth, but not write it down for 30 years never bothers me. The question is, do I have a reason to believe you've distorted it over 30 years? So when you see that the disciples of Jesus, who I think clearly thought that Jesus would come back in their lifetime, you read it in the New Testament, there's a sense of urgency. We got to get to this. We got to get the gospel shared because Jesus is coming. We're in the last days. It's coming. And so they didn't write it down. They preached it immediately. The 40 days preparing the disciples, they pick the replacement for Judas, off they go, and you have the book of Acts recording the constant repetition of the story over and over and over and over and over again. If you were to look at you and I met about 9 years ago. If you were to look at what I was doing we were at Summit Worldview Conference when you met me, and I do that talk I did at Summit Worldview. I've been doing that talk for 20 years. Since I was a youth pastor. I don't know how many years, let's say, well, probably 18. So, and if you were to record the first time I gave that talk about here's how you confirm an eyewitness and here's how I did it, you could actually put those wave files on top of each other. They'd be virtually identical. Even my pauses, even the way if I tell a joke, it's probably in the same place, because when you talk, I'm excited to tell you. And I tell it the same way every time I tell it. If I never wrote the book Cold Case Christianity, but waited until today to write the book, it would contain the same information, because it hasn't changed over time. Well, and I've just been talking about it so often. Now I could just almost take this transcript and write it down. It'll be close to the book. Okay, that's because the constant repetition of something that I feel is important enough to say repeatedly And that's what we have in the New Testament book of Acts. People who are feeling as though there's a sense of urgency. It's important to say this repeatedly. So that never bothered me. Now, here's the other thing. You've got 30 years, and you might think, well, yeah, but how do you remember details in 30 years? But I always say to jurors that not every memory is created equal. If you asked me what my Valentine's Day was like 5 years ago, I couldn't even tell you probably what it was like this year. Okay. I've had 45 Valentine's Days with Susie. I don't remember all of them, except if you ask me about the Valentine's Day in 1988. I can give you that one hour by hour because that's the day we got married. For me, not every Valentine's Day is equal. Some are ingrained more than others. One is ingrained more than others. And most people who watch a homicide, for example, and they're challenged by a defense attorney on the stand 30 years later, I simply have to ask the question in front of a jury, tell me, sir, how many murders have you seen in your lifetime? One. I will never forget it. Not every day is the same as the others. And these kinds of events, the events we see in the pages of the New Testament, are the kind that go, wow, did you see that? Events, those kinds of events stay in your memory. And the degree to which they are recorded slightly different is normal for major events. And so even the fact that these are events that were of high priority, you still see there's slight variations in the way they're recorded because that's the way memory works. That's the way all of us works. That's why we want four gospels, because we know those variations give us the most robust picture of the event that occurred earlier.
Can we just tackle that for a second? Because I meant to hit that earlier when you talked about the contradictions or the apparent contradictions within the different accounts. And I do think that that's something that many lay people or, people online, they read one version, then they read another version. And the surface level way of interpreting that is that there's a contradiction there. Can you give some examples of what are maybe some of the common contradictions that people latch onto, and then help us / me, the audience, understand what's going on here?
Okay, so a couple of things. Number one, remember, we don't have the autographs. We don't have the originals. So we're comparing copies. And although I believe these copies have been meticulously copied, even before we get the first copy, there are errors in the copies. There are variations. What I mean is one will say a slightly different spelling than the other copy, or I'll have a different word, his, instead of, just like no possessive pronoun will be in the other one. So you'll see these differences between the copies. That to me is not an issue because we have a system in place because we have so many copies. We have a way to return to the original reliably. In other words, if I only had 2 copies, I'd be stuck trying to figure out which thing did he say. And there are places where it's, it says that he's, how does he have all this wisdom? How does he know his letters? Well, okay, that means the same thing, but there's 2 different versions of how that is said in scripture. So how do I know what the original had? Well, if I only had 2 copies, it'd be a coin toss. But if I have 100 copies, now 98 have it one way and 2 have it the other way. Well, I kind of know probably which way it was because 2 seem to be at error for the other 2.
So sorry. I'm not meaning to interrupt, but just for clarity's sake. So you're talking about contradictions within different manuscripts that are not the autograph, but slightly different language, slightly different grammar within the 5, 10, 20.
Let me be clear about it.
Yeah.
A contradiction means that these 2 things cannot be reconciled. A variant is different. A variant means that, I can reconcile this. It's an apparent contradiction, but when you really, so for example, if one account says, well, there's only 1 angel because it records the statement of 1 angel, the other account says there were 2 angels there. Well, there are 1 or 2. Is this a contradiction? Well, no. If the first account is somebody who's simply recording the statement made by the 1 angel, it may appear that there's only 1 angel, but where there's 2 angels, there's always 1 angel. So the question is, was there a second angel present? This wasn't mentioned by this author because he's focused in this particular version on the one that spoke. That could appear to be a contradiction. I don't see contradictions. What I see are the kinds of variants we see when 2 people see the same event and edit what they're going to tell me about the event, often based on what they think I want to hear. So they're considering their audience. So they are tailoring their communication for the audience. And I have to help them realize I want to hear all of it. I don't want you to tailor that. I don't want you to do that. I want you to give me all of it.
Hmm.
Or because they have certain interests, and whenever they talk about it, they geek out on that one line of that's what their interest was. If you're a communicator and you're talking about the angel who's communicating, you're probably going to miss the fact. And now I don't have the option of going back and saying, okay, I already talked to the other guy though too. How many angels were there? Like I can't re-interview these folks. So I can't clear up what might be simply the omission based on preference, based on desire, based on interest, based on perspective in the room, all those things that create differences between accounts. I can't do that with the Gospels. This does not shaken me. You think we'd have more confidence if we had 4 Gospels that were word for word identical? Do you think people would be happier about that? They would say, okay, now we know it's legitimate. No,
Mm.
they'd be saying this is a big fabricated lie. So you can't win one way or the other, but this is what reliable eyewitness testimony looks like. Now, why are there variances? Well, it may simply be that the 2 witnesses take a different approach. Some of these, though, when someone like a Bart Ehrman, a skeptic, says, hey, there are more variations between the ancient manuscripts than there are words in the ancient manuscripts,
Right.
he's talking about scribal differences, where a scribe will write it differently based on the manuscript. Now, of course, the reason why we know there's a variation is because we have so many manuscripts and we can compare them to one another. But that's also how we resolve it. The fact that we can identify that this one stands out, this is different over here. Well, this allows us to say, yeah, that is probably the variation we should leave. But here's what I always say when we're doing criminal trials, if a defense attorney says, here's why, jury, you should, this piece of evidence that they have they're offering is terrible, it doesn't mean what they say it means. I always tell the jury, then throw it out. Our case is so strong, we don't need that piece of evidence. If you're troubled by it, just for sake of argument, toss it out. Same thing here. If you're troubled by a variant in a particular verse, rather than just throw the one word variant out, go ahead and throw out the entire verse. Let's take out every verse where you find a variant.
Hmm.
Do better than that. Let's take out every 3rd verse, that variant and the verse next to it too. How about this? Let's take out every other verse. You can take out the odds or the evens and toss them out. They're unreliable. What do you have left? Enough information to know everything we know today about Jesus. As a matter of fact, most of the time when you find a variant in one of the synoptic gospels, like Matthew, and you're inclined to throw that line out, well, it turns out the line that mentions the same thing in the Gospel of Luke is not containing a variant. So now you're going to get the information to come right back in again. That line's not under contest over there. So it's going to come right back in again. You might have a choppier version of the Jesus story, but you don't lose anything about Jesus.
Can I try to repeat this back to you in a really dumbed down way, just for to make sure that I'm getting it right? So, first of all, how many roughly speaking manuscripts do we have
I
for these?
never answer that question because that changes every day. Because what we're counting as manuscripts is any fragment that is found tomorrow or the next day, and that
Okay.
changes not just for scripture. That also changes for all non-biblical documents in antiquity that are discovered, a piece is discovered. So I don't, that's one thing you won't hear me do is say, oh, I'm going to tell you how many manuscript pieces we have over here versus over there. Here's what I would say.
Mm-hmm.
If you had, if the gospels simply contained the story of a simple preaching rabbi in the 1st century who never worked a miracle, never walked on water, was not born of a virgin, didn't rise from the grave, didn't ascend into heaven, just a dude, a smart dude. And he said a lot of things we should live by because they're good advice. But he never did anything to claim, never claimed he was God. Never, no, it's just a guy in the 1st century who
Mm-hmm.
preached a bunch of stuff. There's not a single person who would look at the story of Jesus then and say, wow, this is that would be considered the best attested ancient sage in manuscript history, because
Mm-hmm.
we have so many manuscripts about just the simple sage known as Jesus of Nazareth. There'd
Mm-hmm.
be no contest about how, compared to other simple 1st century or the 4th century BC or 5th century, you go anywhere in 1,000 years of Jesus, there's not nearly as much manuscript evidence to make the case for the existence of this ancient, simple preaching rabbi.
Mm-hmm.
But put in one miracle, and suddenly we can't trust any of it. And that
Right.
exposes for me that the argument is not that we don't have enough reliable manuscript evidence.
Mm-hmm.
It's that we don't like what it says. And it's a presuppositional bias against the supernatural, because if there was no supernatural stuff in there, trust me, everyone would just go, yep, he existed and he said exactly what those documents say he said.
And that's what I was trying to get at. Yeah, in terms of like without naming a precise number, but it's thousands is my understanding. We're talking about thousands of different manuscripts, which is way more than many other historic events are documented.
Yeah, of
So
course. We always talk about how many manuscripts there are, how close is the actual occurrence. So, I'll give you an example of this.
yeah.
Josephus records certain things that some people will say in his ancient histories are different than, like, say, for example, the Gospel of Luke. So, why should you trust Luke when Josephus makes a claim that seems to be contrary to Luke? My
Mm-hmm.
question is, of course, is why would you trust what we have from Josephus? These were not as well protected as the ancient manuscripts for scripture, because Josephus's work was not considered scripture, and he didn't have disciples who carefully coveted his work and protected it. Not only that, the earliest copy of any of Josephus's works is far, far, far more distant to the actual events than the
Mm-hmm.
Gospels are. I mean, if I had to just look at it from a manuscript evidence perspective,
Mm-hmm.
Luke's Gospel is far better attested as an ancient manuscript than Josephus is. Anything we have from Josephus. So why is it? But well, here's why: because we're looking for some way to dispel, to get rid of, to redact
Mm-hmm.
the events around Jesus. And, it's not, and to be honest, it's worse than that now. So if 50 years ago, I think the only effort is let's get rid of the supernatural. So
Mm-hmm.
like the Jesus Project and places where people were skeptical and wanted to kind of try to get back to an original document that doesn't include, it was all based on supernaturalism. Let's get that supernatural stuff out. Let's get
Mm-hmm.
out the myth. I think today the bigger problem is that nobody wants to embrace the moral teaching of Jesus. So even if there was no miracle making involved in the Gospels, I don't think you'd like Jesus very much. Not if you hold to the world's views related to gender identity and sexuality and marriage and all the other hot button topics. That if you read Jesus, you're either going to have to reinterpret him or redact him heavily to make him less offensive to your own cultural sensibilities today. So I think what's happened now is it's not just about the supernatural stuff. Is I don't think people have it. And if people tell you today, well, I don't like Christianity much, but or Christians much, but that Christ guy seems like he's okay. They probably haven't read him, because if they were to read him and see that he has a view of marriage between a man and a woman, he affirms the Mosaic description of marriage, I think they wouldn't like him. I mean, this is the problem: is that, and make no mistake about it, if you're listening to this and you're a Christ follower, if they reject the moral teaching of your master, they are rejecting your master. So I think in the end, we have to see this is the shift that's happening right now. It's always been there. It's always been some
Mm-hmm.
people who would reject the teaching of Jesus, but I think we're at a most dramatic tipping point, at least in America, because I can see that most people, most young people, for example, are going to have to at least admit that if you follow Jesus of Nazareth, you'll be one of the least popular people on social media for sure.
True. So I would like to pull back just a little bit to talk about this idea of evidence more generally speaking. I think that I would like to hear as a cold case detective, tell me about evidence. And the subtext to this question is that this is probably the number one thing that I continuously see online is still no evidence. There's still no evidence. I haven't seen any evidence. Where is the evidence? And that is it's like a meme at this point for the existence of God, for the creation of the universe, and also for things related to Jesus from Nazareth, his resurrection. It's something that can be just labeled on top of anything. Still no evidence. And I think what is meant by that is no physical evidence, or I guess to use a term that is probably more in your line of work, it would be like forensic evidence. But what types of evidences are there? So help me. How would you respond to those to that meme?
Yeah, it's people who've never done a jury trial. They've never convicted anybody, never tried anybody. That's the only people who make those kinds of silly statements. Same people will say there's more than enough evidence to confirm multiverse theory. So what qualifies as evidence then? Everything. Everything has the potential to be used as evidence. Everything. What's in the crime scene, of course, that's going to be used. What's missing from the crime scene, well, that's going to be used too. We're going to talk about what should have been there but wasn't. What did he say? We're going to count that against him. What did he fail to say? We're going to use that too. What did he do? What did he fail to do? It's the yin and the yang. Every little thing. It's death by 1,000 paper cuts. And this is particularly true when you're working cold cases, because These are usually weak evidentially to begin with. So we have to assemble a broad, overarching, cumulative circumstantial case. So let's just talk about the quality of evidence and what evidence categories there are. Look, there's no hard evidence for anything. That's not a category. So when someone says you have no hard evidence, that's not a category. There's only two categories of evidence: direct evidence and indirect evidence. Everything you find at a crime scene or you use in a jury trial is going to fall into one of those two. What did he fail to say? That's going to fall into the indirect category. The only thing that falls into the direct category is an eyewitness observation, something that the eye sees and then records and then reiterates to a jury. And that also can be video from your glowing rectangle or your phone. That is direct evidence as well. But we don't have direct evidence in cold cases like that. Usually because if we had an eyewitness who saw it back then, it would have been tried back then and would have been settled back then. We don't have an, that's why it's cold. It was lame to begin with. So a lot of that for us, I don't get, everything else is indirect. Fingerprint evidence, that's indirect. So you want, some people have a tendency to think, well, direct is the good stuff, indirect is the not so good stuff. No, it's just different. It's also called, by the way, indirect evidence is also called circumstantial evidence. And there's a jury instruction that judges give in California and in every state in the union that says you're to treat indirect and direct evidence, direct and circumstantial evidence with the exact same level of authority. You are not to think that one is less than the other. That's a jury instruction. My cases don't have direct evidence, but DNA, that's indirect, that's circumstantial. Fingerprints are circumstantial, gunshot residue, blood spatter evidence, any material evidence we collect at the scene and test forensically, that's all indirect evidence. It's all circumstantial evidence. So what happens is in a direct evidence, it's about, well, do I trust that what he is saying is reliable? That's what a second half of Cold Case Christianity, the book I wrote, is all about. How do we test to determine if someone is a liar? So it's about reliability of witnesses. If you've got a case that's just got a bunch of eyewitnesses, now it's about testing your eyewitnesses. And now, if you've got a case where you don't have any eyewitnesses and it's all indirect, it's about making sure you have the proper inference from the cumulative set of evidences. And this is, by the way, how scientists arrive at multiverse theory. It's not like they have some, like, I mean, direct, no one's seen it. They have to build a case cumulatively on the basis of things that you might think, really, that would even qualify as evidence? Yeah, everything qualifies as evidence. So you can use anything. And this is why when I do a jury trial, we often, well, always, we will interview the jurors after the verdict, because we want to see, like, what was persuasive for you? We're always stunned by the little nonsense thing that they found persuasive. We almost didn't include it, but luckily we did. We didn't think it was that powerful. But when you're doing a cumulative case, every little piece that points to the same inference, every little piece starts to become important. So in the end, do we have evidence to suggest that Yes. Do we have evidence to suggest that the Gospels are reliable? Yes. And I outline that. But what would that evidence be? It's everything. I can include anything. If I find a thing in the dirt archaeologically, I can include that. Now, that's going to be forensic. The same way, if I found a piece of evidence you left at the crime scene that I could tie to you, that's a forensic find. Something I find in the dirt is forensic. If I find an archaeology that affirms something that is claimed in Scripture, when we found that the polytarchs, the people that Luke describes in the book of Acts, that for thousands of 1700 years, nobody could find any confirmation outside of the book of Acts. And then we find a inscription in archaeology that in the exact place where he says it happens. Well, that counts. That's forensic. So in the end, it's to say that we don't have any still waiting. What you really mean is still waiting for the unreasonably high standard I have set for myself, because I never intend on believing in this anyway.
And it's a standard that is not
typically saying.
Yeah, exactly. And it's a standard that's not symmetrically applied to everything.
So let me just say this to you. So the standard for jury trials for the most heinous crimes that we would ever try that might cause a suspect to be assigned the death penalty, that standard is not beyond a possible doubt, because we could never prove anything beyond a possible doubt. Nothing. There's nothing you think you know that I couldn't level some possible doubt against. There's nothing. So the standard is not beyond a possible doubt, because you can never reach it. The standard is beyond a reasonable doubt. Reasonable doubt is a lower standard. There's a gap then between possible and reasonable. And that gap is what's called your unanswered questions. So we ask people all the time. I tell jurors all the time, I'm going to tell you everything you need to know, but not everything that could be known,
Mm-hmm.
because I don't even know everything that could be known. So I can only show you now. I've got more than enough evidence that'll point you in a direction that points right to that defendant. It doesn't point 1 foot to the left of him or 1 foot to the right of him. That evidence trail leads right up to him, but it stops short of him. That gap between the end of the evidence trail and him is called your unanswered questions. But it turns out I'm asking you to take a step across that gap and render what we call a verdict, but it's not blind. You've got more than enough evidence to get you beyond a reasonable doubt. I just don't have enough evidence to get you beyond a possible doubt. But trust me, there's nothing you know beyond a possible doubt. You'd be paralyzed by what could possibly happen tomorrow. You wouldn't even leave your house if your standard was, I have to know beyond a possible doubt that I won't die in the car on the freeway, that it won't, that lightning won't strike that. You can't live that way.
Mm-hmm.
Same is true for the biblical worldview. There's more than enough evidence that points to the reliability of Scripture. It doesn't point a foot to the left or a foot to the right.
Hmm.
Now, there's a gap at the end of that that has all of your unanswered questions in it. And we're going to ask you to take a step across the end of that evidence trail called a step of faith. But
Hmm.
it's not blind. It's as informed as any evidence trail, but it still will require you to take a step. This is why God talks about faith in Scripture. He doesn't, the word hope in Scripture is not like wishful thinking.
Mm-hmm.
It's the assured confidence on the basis of what you do know, that you can trust what you don't yet know.
Hmm.
So that is the step we ask people to take. But this is not what's happening in the church. For the most part, I don't see anybody even talking about the evidence in the church. But I knew as a skeptic, there's no way I could make that step unless I knew where the evidence chain led. I need to know, where's that going?
Right.
I'm going to have unanswered questions, but I'm comfortable across unanswered questions. They just can't be every question. A juror at some point is going to get to that point where it's like, yeah, I can make that step. I can render a verdict. Now, here's the
Yes.
problem: is you don't know how long the evidence trail needs to be for each and every juror. I get that. And if you're listening to this right now, I don't know how comfortable you are. What's the gap you can step across? And this is interesting to me, that God would leave any gap at all. And I think the
Mm-hmm.
reason why God leaves that gap is it turns out it's our submission and humility to love Jesus as Savior that is what He's after. And if love is what you're after, you're going to have to leave the option for hate, because love has to be offered freely. So I cannot overwhelm people that I am asking to love me, because then if they say, okay, I love you, it does not really love.
Mm-hmm.
Instead, I have to give you more than enough reason to know this is true, but enough wiggle room for you to reject it. And that's what we see in the evidence trail.
I think that the line of reasoning that you just laid out is so interesting as well, because the definition of what is reasonable doubt in some sense is subjective. And what I mean by that, I know that there is an objective reality to it, but what I mean is that something could be considered unreasonable to an individual if they don't understand the context or the evidence, or if they don't have the full picture. And that is the reason why I wanted to talk to you in the first place, and why I love conversations like this that help to build out the historic context and that give a better understanding of why, once you see all of these pieces beginning to fit together, then that definition of reasonable and reasonable doubt, it actually makes sense, and it actually is met by, and I love this analogy that you're giving, that each individual human is like a member of a cosmic jury, that we each do get the opportunity to contribute to some sort of a verdict, but it's not a collective verdict. It's really a personal verdict. But we're actually given the opportunity to cast our vote. We're able to deploy our free will in a legitimate sense towards or against the evidence. And I just think conversations like this are awesome, because it I think takes that idea of reasonable, and it helps you see that there is a reasonableness to faith. It's not just blind faith, that there is actually historic evidence, and that there is very legitimate reasons to believe that this is true. And I love what you said too. And there's a whole other direction I want to go here. But I would, rather than doing that, because we could save that maybe for hour two, where we're planning on going more into the outside of the Bible and the impact of Christianity on history, the secular sources. There's a whole other direction that I want to go here. Maybe we'll save that for part 2 of this, that we can, whatever, upload second on the channel or whatever. But the last thing I wanted to say is that just to use an analogy, if there's someone who, let's say, is from a different culture or context, or maybe they're on a remote island, whatever, pick your scenario, and they just don't understand certain information. For example, a cell phone would be an extremely unreasonable thing unless you understood the different parts that make it up and allow it to work. And I think that, and that's not a perfect analogy, but there's a sense of the more that you know about something, the more reasonable it is to believe that thing. And I think that for that reason, this type of conversation is so great, because I do think it addresses a lot of these questions that people have, where when those questions are unanswered, then Christianity doesn't hit that level of reasonable doubt. But I think as those questions are answered, like you said, it brings you closer and closer to where you can see that there is a reasonableness to this.
Well, and let me just say one last thing about that. So there's two reasons why. Yeah, I love his content. I know what the evidence is, but it's a worse, more sinister kind of thing that's always at play. And when you talk about this is what guides all jury selection. I don't put anyone on a jury. I don't put everyone on a jury. You get 150 people in the jury room called for jury duty, and I only gonna put 12 in the box. Let's say 4 alternates. Okay, and I got 16 people I'm going to pick from those 100 people. Who gets picked? Well, we eliminate the people who have presuppositional biases that either are for the prosecutor or for the defense team. On that spectrum of 1 to 4, 1 who are people who are sold out for prosecutors and cops, and 4 people who are sold out for defense attorneys and defendants. Well, we're not going to allow a 4. They're not going to allow a 1. When we start selecting the jury, we're looking for 2s and 3s. We have to eliminate people who are just unwilling to, with humility, look at the evidence. If they think they know better before we start, it's impossible to go anywhere. We win our cases at jury selection, sad as that is. And this is why jury selection is so important. Now, a lot of this comes down to your precept. The first rule I talk about in cold case Christianity, how to become a detective, 10 tools you need in your toolbox. The first one is don't be a know-it-all. If you walk in thinking you know the answer before you begin, then it's not a matter of how much evidence I show you. You'll find a way to interpret that evidence towards your presupposition. If you walk in and this is a woman who's killed in her bedroom, then you start asking, well, is she married? Well, she's got an ex-husband. Oh, he's our guy. And now we work the ex-husband for a week, because the odds are usually good that if there's a dead woman who's been divorced and her, I'm going to look at the husband first. But if that's it, if I refuse to move off of him when the evidence starts to fail to demonstrate he's my guy, I'm allowing my presuppositional bias, because I've had so many cases where this was the case, to guide into now I'm misinterpreting the evidence in favor of him, because I've already decided it is him. So we have to, that the biggest problem we have with assessing any set of evidence is typically our presuppositions. It's our biases. So if you're listening to this, I mean, it's not just a matter of knowing what the evidence is. Yeah, I hope you do. I hope you take time to, it's also assessing who are you and who do you think you are? And a lot of it, look, this is the biggest challenge for Christianity, is that, and it's interesting because I've got another book coming out next year where I talk more about this. The first step in Christianity is a step that most of us pridefully won't take. It's a step of humility. Humility happens to be an attribute of human character that will lead, surprisingly, to the best changes in your human flourishing if you'll simply adopt humility. Everything that we measure in terms of flourishing and thriving as humans improves for those who are humble. Your level and depth of your relationships, your work life, how good an employee or how good an employer, how long you live, what your mental health is, what your physical health is, how well you're educated, how high you ascend in your education, how much money you make. Every way you measure, humility changes everything. And interestingly, the Christian worldview leverages this because this is a design feature from the Creator. But that means that in order to access the truth of Christianity, you'd have to start by realizing maybe I don't know everything. Maybe I'm allowing my biases or my prideful sense that I want it my way on my conditions and my timing is stopping you from seeing something that's true. And it's often that, to me, is far more prevalent and far more dangerous than, well, I just don't know what the facts are. Because people who are prideful, it doesn't matter if you show them the facts. They'll find a way to reinterpret those, because it's not what's driving us is our own lack of humility. So I think in the end, the reason why we become Christians is because at some point we say, there is a God and I'm not him. And we have to at least get to that point where we praise and cherish and embrace humility. And for no other reason, if you aren't a God follower or you're not a Christian, it will change the trajectory of your life. And if you allow it to change that trajectory, you might just reconsider all the evidence for God as well.
It's amazing the amount of time and effort that Christians spend trying to convince people that water is wet, but it's only because we have swallowed it and enjoyed it, and we know that it satisfies, and we want to share that living water, if you will, with other people. Or else, what's the point of even a conversation like this? That being said, where can people find you?
You can find me at coldcasechristianity.com. We just have a 10th anniversary re-release of the book Cold Case Christianity, and we have a case maker's course. So if you really wanted to deep dive into these issues and learn how to articulate them for others, if you purchase the book, the 10th anniversary, we're giving away that 10.5 hour course for free. Just go to coldcasechristianitybook.com.
Amazing. Thank you so much for your time.